sort out your problems and live in peace. My name is Roy Burton, and I lived through the 5 years of occupation.
In 1940, Germany began a 5-year occupation of the Channel Islands between France and Britain. It began with German planes bombing Guernsey's St. Peter Port Harbour after mistaking a fleet of tomato trucks for troop carriers. 48 hours later, troops landed, and the swastika was raised. Earthling Stories met up with local history lover Jill Gerard and some centenarians to get a sense of life under the occupation.
I've become totally engrossed with our amazing, colourful history, and especially the hardships the island went through during the Second World War when we were occupied by the Germans for 5 years. So the Channel Islands are not really part of France, they're not really part of England, we're very independent, but strategically during the Second World War we were very important, and we were the only part of British soil that the Germans occupied. So they were very proud of occupying some British soil, and we had to endure the 5 years of occupation. So when the Germans came, Hitler was very intent on turning Guernsey into a static battleship. So they built nearly 1,000 bunkers, tunnels, towers, lookouts, which are all still here. And behind me you can see one which is a directional finding tower. And these reported back to some great big gun emplacements that were set back in the island called the Mirrors batteries. There were 4 of them with huge guns in them. They were built by the slave workers, and they were built incredibly well and very strong. They all had walls that were 1 metre thick, ceilings, floors, almost impossible to destroy at the end of the occupation. So you can see the extent of and the size of the buildings that they created. This one you can hardly see anything above ground, but like all the bunkers, they go down and down and down. I always say they're a bit like icebergs. The bit you see at the top is only a very small part of what you see. And they dominated the landscape. After the occupation, certainly my in-laws, nobody wanted to talk about them, and they were covered over, and you can drive around the island and not realise that all those sort of bumps that you're passing are actually German bunkers. They were absolutely everywhere.
Bunkers were not the only underground structures built in wartime Guernsey. Hundreds of slave labourers hewed 7,000 square metres of tunnels out of rock to create a subterranean hospital should the occupying troops be bombed by the Allies.
So this is an example of what the wards would have looked like, these awful beds. You can see how they're sort of jointed so they can move people's legs up if they needed to put the legs up. But I just can't imagine what it must have been like to be in here trying to get better from an injury.
When, in 1940, word spread that an attack on the Channel Islands was imminent, the locals had to decide whether to stay or to flee. These decisions were made amidst chaos and panic. In Guernsey, evacuation began with the children. 5,000 pupils and 500 teachers escaped the island on boats. It would be 5 years before they saw home again.
I went with my mother. My father was going to come on the next boat the following day, and there was never a next boat. So we were moved right up north, and for 5 years my mother didn't know whether he was alive or dead.
And neither did you?
No. I can just remember being very, very lonely. My mother only had me, and I only had my mother. And the authorities found out that she could sew, so she had to go and work in the sewing room at the Wakefield Hospital.
My parents had the dreadful decision to make. Was my mother going to come with me, or was I going to go with the school? I mean, my parents, they made the decision on the basis, it was firmly believed in that time, that the war was going to last 6 months. And everything would be over and I'd be back home. Obviously, that proved far from correct.
My name is Diana Chesney, and I lived in the occupation right through the war. Well, I think it made me more forceful than I would have been. Yes, I think so.
These two members in my book here are two that was friends with my grandparents. And that night we had a plane was up over the top, and all the searchlights around the island went up, and this one at what we call the Griffle was the most powerful one, and it caught the plane up there, and we could see the plane from our farm ducking and diving and trying to get out of the, but I think the plane was in the middle and the searchlight was so wide they couldn't get out. So finally they got fed up and they dived down the beam, and one soldier was relieved because he was in my grandmother's kitchen off duty, but all the rest of the troop was killed in the compartment. Yeah.
The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society.
These people had to actually live with their enemy.
This film, released in 2018, tells the story of Guernsey's occupation and the clever ways its citizens dealt with their hardships.
You've yet to have the full experience. Potato peel pie.
During the occupation, there was a great shortage of food, and people had to be really inventive. They had to make things out of all sorts of things, anything they could find, and potatoes was one of the things they could grow, and so they did all sorts of things. They made potato puddings, they even made a sort of mock rice pudding. I'm going to make a potato peel pie, but they used them in all sorts of different ways to try and vary their diet. So I'm going to peel these potatoes, but the peelings are not wasted. They're used to make the crust. If you lived in the country, you were much better off than the poor people who lived in town who didn't have a garden. But here, they could grow their vegetables outside, and although you had to give them to the Germans for distribution, it was easy to keep some back for your family. My father-in-law was a teacher, and he was appalled at how many children came to school, and all they brought to school for their lunch was fried potato peelings. So he got together with local families in the parish, and they hid root vegetables in pits, and then were able to make a soup for the children, which they took to school. So this is the base, which I made a little bit earlier. So I'm going to fill this with mashed potato and a little bit of chives. But in the war, they'd have been short of everything. There was no salt. People had to use seawater, and they couldn't get onto the beaches because the beaches were all mined. And this is wartime potato peel pie.
On May the 8th, 1945, Winston Churchill announced what half the world had been waiting for.
After very nearly 5 years of German occupation, the Channel Islands were free.
And May the 9th is still today celebrated as Liberation Day, a powerful ritual in the only part of Britain to know the sting of wartime occupation.
Don't sit under the apple tree, no one else but me, till I come marching